The heat enveloped me from head to toe, thick and viscous, like water slowly trickling down my skin. I sat with my back against the wooden slats, feeling the warmth from them seep deeper, filling my body with relaxation and something akin to peace. The humid air in the sauna created a dense mist, making the outlines of the room blur slightly, adding even more intimacy to this place. How many times had I come here to be alone, in silence and tranquility? And how many times had I shared this small, enclosed world with him? Today was different. When he entered the sauna and sat opposite me, I felt a tension unlike any other. His presence seemed to thicken the air, making it more viscous and unbearably hot. My eyes were closed, but I could feel him looking at me from time to time, perhaps stealthily, perhaps with a hint of embarrassment. It seemed to me that each of his glances left a trace, barely noticeable but palpable, like a faint tingling on my skin. I was aware of his attention, this quiet timidity mixed with something deeper, something I couldn't quite name. In his presence, my thoughts wandered down strange paths, something inside me hinting that here, amidst this soft enveloping heat, I could relax, allow myself to feel something forbidden. I tried to focus on the silence, on the gentle hiss of the steam, but each time my thoughts returned to him. Between us, there seemed to be some energy, invisible but tangible, something that couldn't be put into words. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, I quietly asked, breaking the silence and giving myself the opportunity to look at him directly, to catch that almost boyish expression on his face. "Are you okay over there?" My voice sounded soft, but there might have been a playfulness in it, a sense that his answer could be more meaningful than a simple yes or no. His response came with a hint of confusion, and I noticed how he shifted slightly, nervously, as if hoping that this would help him hide his agitation. "Yeah, just hot in here," he said softly, and I saw his gaze quickly slide down, studying my collarbone, damp with sweat. I felt how this filled the air around us with something hotter than any steam, making the moment between us almost tangible. Asterisk. I watched him, trying to keep my expression neutral, but inside me, something more was growing, a mix of curiosity, anticipation, and even some forgotten feeling. His tense shoulders, the barely perceptible stiffness in his movements. All of this was clear to me, like an open book, and I felt a kind of boldness growing inside me. Leaning forward slightly, I casually adjusted my towel, feeling his gaze fixed on this movement. Leaning back, I closed my eyes, but remained fully alert to catch his slightest movement, glance, or sigh. Silently, without a single word, we were playing a strange game, the rules of which we had not discussed. This moment felt forbidden, almost dangerous, and that's what made it so sharp. Finally, in the silence broken only by the gentle hiss of the steam, I spoke again, allowing my voice to sound soothing and slightly inviting. "You seem quiet today. Something on your mind?" I asked, knowing that this might push him to open up, but also understanding that he would probably prefer to keep his thoughts to himself. His response was, as I expected, vague. He muttered something about different thoughts, and I caught how his hand involuntarily ran through his damp hair, clearly relieving tension. There was something touching about this gesture, but also something that suggested his inner conflict, and I couldn't suppress the warm wave of tenderness mixed with a fleeting desire to know exactly what thoughts were in his head right now. I leaned back, allowing myself to relax, closing my eyes again, but I couldn't get rid of this light excitement, the feeling that our glances and barely perceptible movements were revealing something new between us, something we hadn't allowed to surface before. For a moment, I even felt an irresistible desire to reach out and touch him, even with a light, fleeting movement, to erase the boundary between us. Feeling the tension thickening, I decided to say a few more words, as if hinting, as if giving us both the right to this feeling. Maybe it's just the heat, but it feels different here, doesn't it? I whispered, barely audible, but loud enough to hang in the air between us, like a challenge or an invitation that he could accept or reject. And then, hearing his timid, "Yeah, it does," I realized that something completely new had arisen between us, some silent understanding. He hesitated, his gaze scanning the room, but I knew that at that moment, he, like me, was acutely aware of every inch of space between us, his hands clenched on his knees, and how our towels seemed to separate us, though with each second they seemed less and less necessary. When I quietly patted the bench next to me, he hesitated, but finally approached and sat so close that our breath became part of a common rhythm. I almost heard his heart beating, felt the warmth of his skin. It mixed with the steam, with the humid air, and all this only intensified the tension that I could not ignore. I felt both collected and relaxed at the same time, but I knew, as soon as I opened my eyes, I would see in his gaze what was happening between us right now. We sat so close that our legs almost touched. It seemed that my own thoughts were laid bare, and I could no longer hide them, just as I could not ignore the heat that had flared up in me, not allowing me to sit quietly. I leaned my head back again, exposing my neck, as if giving him some sign. At that moment, I felt him shiver slightly next to me, as if his body's reaction was happening without his participation, against his will. The words I spoke were almost a whisper, as if I was afraid to break this fragile connection, but at the same time, I was drawn to surrender to the moment. "I think about how much you've grown," I murmured, knowing that these words held a much deeper meaning than just a compliment. I saw how he swallowed, his face tense, and the look with which he looked at me was the look of a person crossing a line, knowing that there was no turning back. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded soft, almost childlike, and at the same time filled with awareness. "You've always been there for me," he said, as if trying to find justification, an explanation for our shared past, which now became the backdrop for what was happening between us here and now. These words left a trace in the air between us, making it even thicker and tangible. I knew that this should have confused me, made me recoil, but instead, I felt only how it drew us even closer together. The silence that hung over us after his words was not the silence of emptiness, but the space for something inevitable, for something that I felt with every cell of my body. "I should probably go." He finally broke the silence, but his words sounded restrained, almost unconvincing. I saw how he struggled with himself, felt that his entire being screamed to stay. I looked up, lingering on his face, and again, as if casually, touched his hand. His reaction was lightning fast. He seemed to freeze, not moving, as if any movement could be the last straw, deciding everything. I leaned in a little closer, and the words that escaped my lips were almost inaudible. "Or you could stay." Asterisk. When I uttered those words, it seemed that time stopped, and the air between us became even thicker, more saturated. He did not move away. In his gaze, directed at me, I saw doubt, but behind it lay something much deeper, almost uncontrollable. His body, his hands, the tension in his face, all of it spoke of how strongly he was struggling with himself. But in that gaze, there was also a longing for something long inaccessible, forbidden. I quietly watched him, seeing how he hesitated, and this almost deprived me of strength. We were so close to each other that I felt how the hot air enveloping his body became mine, his breath mixed with mine, and we could no longer remain just two people on opposite sides of the sauna. I wanted to make a move, to overcome this last distance between us, to touch him, to feel him in a way that I could no longer ignore. Finally, I couldn't stand it any longer and reached out, lightly touching his hand. My finger barely touched his skin, but even this light touch seemed to pierce him through. He shuddered, and his eyes met mine, full of questions, confusion, and suppressed desire. This moment was filled with a power that I found difficult to cope with. I felt his hand freeze under my touch. His breath became ragged, as if he was on the brink of something he needed to do, but which frightened him no less than me. "It's okay," I whispered, reassuring him and, perhaps, myself that we had the right to this moment. My words, sounding like some mantra, seemed to lift the last shackles from him, and he made a tiny, barely noticeable step forward, bringing us even closer. I felt his warmth enveloping me, his hesitations giving way to something more decisive. And when he spoke, his voice was almost unrecognizable, soft, tense, as if behind every word lay something more than just an ordinary phrase. This feels different," he whispered, his gaze lingering on me, and in that instant, an understanding arose between us. I knew he felt the same, and it was like a silent acknowledgement, a silent call to continue, to let go of all the restraints that held us back. Without thinking any further, I leaned in closer, and our foreheads touched. This gesture was so light, almost accidental, but at the same time, it meant everything. He froze, but did not recoil, did not back away, and in this gentle touch lay the answer to all our silent questions. Our breath became one, the air between us filled with tension that could no longer be ignored. Then I did what I had long feared, but which I knew every previous second had led us to. I lightly ran my finger along his arm, touched his shoulder, and at that moment, barely breathing, I leaned into his lips, pausing for a moment to give him the chance to stop me. But he did not pull away, and in the next second, I felt the taste of his kiss, barely perceptible, gentle, but in it lay a whole universe of suppressed emotions, questions, and answers. The kiss lasted an eternity, filled with what we had hidden for so long, what was beyond the permissible, but turned out to be too strong to ignore. Glad you liked it. I'll continue with the fifth and final section to reveal the climax and conclusion of this story, maintaining the tense, intimate atmosphere and emphasizing the consequences of their choice. When the kiss finally broke, we both remained in place, barely breathing, still immersed in that moment. As if stunned, we couldn't tear ourselves away from each other, and I felt, for the first time in a long time, completely naked, not physically, but emotionally. I held his gaze, in which I read surprise and confusion, but also something more, something that had crossed all the barriers we had erected between us. He looked at me, and in his eyes, I saw the same question that was in my heart. And now what? We had crossed a line that had been inviolable for us until then, and even if the silence between us spoke of acceptance, I knew that realization was still ahead. The quiet, barely audible sound of the steam hissing filled the room, and my thoughts were already flying far from here, into that future where we would face the consequences. I felt how my body reacted to him, how desire made me return to this moment, to his touch again and again, but I also felt fear. Were we really ready for what this moment would change in both of us? Perhaps it was a naive hope, to think that the moments spent together here could be left without consequences. I allowed myself to embrace him again, feeling how our breath slowly evened out, as if we were in a common harmony, at least for this brief moment. He carefully ran his hand along my back, and his touch was so familiar and so new that it brought tears to my eyes. We simply sat, embracing, listening to the silence, feeling each other's breath, as if afraid that after everything that had happened, speaking words would be too dangerous. Finally, I realized that it was time to leave this small, enclosed world where there was only us two, and returned to reality. I carefully pulled away, reaching for my towel, understanding that I would have to look him in the eyes and acknowledge everything. When our gazes met again, I smiled at him, softly, reassuringly, as if saying that I regretted nothing, but knew that we both had a difficult path ahead. "We need to get out of here," I said, not knowing what his reaction would be, but he just nodded, responding to me with the same understanding look. Leaving the sauna, we found ourselves in the damp and cool air, as if every breath returned us to reality, devoid of the magic that surrounded us there. But when he looked at me, I felt again that the magic had not gone anywhere. It remained between us, alive and indestructible, like a promise that whatever lay ahead, we would go through it together. He looked at me, and I understood that, despite all the fears and questions, he felt the same. In his eyes, I saw that we would return to this conversation, that we would find a way to accept everything that had happened between us as an inevitable continuation of who we had been to each other all these years. "We'll figure it out," I said softly and confidently, and although the path ahead was uncertain, I knew that we could handle it together.